Okay, so my name is Rod, and I play Monsterpocalypse at Nightwatch Games in San Antonio.
And my name is Josh, and I also play Monsterpocalypse at Nightwatch Games in San Antonio.
Okay, and I asked you to have this conversation to talk a little bit about Armodax, because I sort of feel that we have a different experience from a lot of people in terms of I play protectors, you play destroyers. I've played a few games with Armodax, and it was tough for you at first, but you seem to have gotten a handle on how to keep him under control after a few games. And so it's been a while since I've played him, but I wanted to try to get this on the record, what you've been doing against him, just because, like I said, I think we may have a different experience from a lot of people out there, and maybe people will find it valuable.
Yeah.
So I did want to point out something to start with, which is that in terms of our local group, it's mostly you and me are the most consistent players. There's a couple of other players, but no one is playing things like Shadow Sun, really. So it's sort of it may not be exactly the same as what most people would think of the competitive Monsterpocalypse meta. I do try my best to play a good game, and I think you do too, but we're not necessarily, shadow stun stuffing each other on turn one. So if that's relevant to what people are thinking about Armodax, it's that's the limit of our experiences, is we have the experience with him in that context.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the problems that people have with Armodax, at least from what I've seen, has just been that I could be wrong here, but it appears that Armodax destroying their power base is kind of the thing that seems to mess people up the most, because they feel like they can't necessarily do anything against him as a monster because of either resilience, blocking super damage on a couple of monsters. Really, Hammerclack is the only one. Well, or Terracon would be the only ones that would really have access to super damage in alpha form. But I think chiefly it's just getting deprived of power dice that people have trouble with, and then and armored. Because it completely upends the idea of how you do damage to monsters and how you win the damage race. Because throwing Armodax into a building takes almost as many resources as throwing any other monster into a building, but you're only doing 2 damage or 1 damage instead of 3 or 2, and so it can be kind of rough going into that.
Well, I did want to talk about that, because it is, one thing I think that you were doing was sort of discovering how to right size your commitment against it, your dice commitment against Armodax, both in terms of hitting him with monster damage and in terms of hitting him with unit damage as well, and sort of handling him that way. But I guess, well, let me go ahead and to serve dessert before dinner, I think your big insight was to not try to focus down Armodax first, right?
Yeah, so I think that in general, this isn't so much a knock against Armodax or like how to handle Armodax. This is maybe a little bit more general advice, but it seems like high mobility is very strong. Flight is very strong. Being able to avoid types of damage can be pretty strong in the later parts of the game. And so regardless of Armodax, it feels like generally if you can take out a monster with high mobility first, if there's only one on the enemy team, and leave in the late game them having to deal with a monster that does not have flight or high mobility, that typically ends up working out pretty well. I'm not going to say it always works, and again, pretty much any of the advice that we have or any of our experiences that we have is not going to be like universal. This stuff isn't always going to work. It's kind of a thing you have to take as it comes and be creative.
And you still have to have those, core gameplay skills like of positioning and understanding dice tempo, dice commitments, and things like that.
But I think that generally with Armodax, it feels like if you can ignore Armodax by just moving past him and getting to the enemy monster, if the Armodax player is content to wreck your power base, then he's closer to your units. The general sort of idea that I go into Armodax with is Armodax is way lower defense-wise on his alpha side compared to his hyper side. That's the same for a lot of monsters, but since his defense is only 7 on alpha, lowering it with flank or spotter makes it only 6, and defense 6 is tremendously easier for units to hit. You really only need, with flank or spotter involved, maybe 3 or 4 units working in tandem in order to get a monster damage in. That still leaves you unit spawns, attacks on enemy units, things like that, and so you could still maintain control over the board. Or you can just go whole hog and say, okay, I only need 3 or 4 dice to hit Armodax once. What if I take those same 3 or 4 dice and I just hit him twice instead? And all of that goes away when Armodax goes into hyper, because Armodax goes up to a normal monster defense of 8. And once his defense is normal, then it takes, again, a significant dice investment in order to actually do something to him and do damage. So the idea generally was ignore Armodax when he comes at me, because he's got to come at me. He's all melee. Have my units take care of him. My units are going to die. My units are going to have to get replaced. And my units might not always hit. But have the units take care of Armodax while he's in alpha, and it's easy for them to do so. Then have my 2 monsters that are not dealing with Armodax just run away, go straight for the enemy monster that is not Armodax, try to knock them out first, and hopefully in that 2-on-1 situation, I can actually get some kind of advantage. That maybe I walk away with 1 monster, maybe I walk away with 2, that one of them is limping. Either one of those situations seems fine. Right. When it's Armodax on the other side and he's already taken a couple of unit damage. Now, if I'm fighting you on your side of the board, then I could have also ended up in a sim situation where I'm taking unit damage. But like you mentioned, kind of with that action dice economy and tempo, then presumably if my defense values are higher than Armodax's, then you've had to spend more action dice overall in order to hit my monsters than I've had to hit yours.
Right.
And at least that's the idea. Armodax is alpha, let my units take care of it. I'll deal with your other monster first. Then once that monster's gone, or Armodax goes into hyper, then I need my monsters involved, because the units are just not going to cut it at that point.
Right. Well, I don't think you were actually using your units to hyper him. First of all, it's still pretty difficult to get
that's a lot of damage
out of your units. But second of all, it's actually the other reason it's good to leave Armodax till last is that his hyper is one of the best support hypers in the game. And if he hypers while the other monster is still on the board, then it's much better than if you kill that other monster first, I think, and then hyper him, and maybe you've got high mobility, he doesn't. Like I said, like I was telling you before we started recording, like the last game I played against you, where you were sort of keeping Armodax, you were sort of finding positions where I couldn't do more than 1 damage to you on, say, Destruction or Calamity. I can't remember what map we were playing, but I had 10 power dice that whole time, but there's just no place on the board where you were standing where I could get 2 damage into you.
Right. So I guess that's the other kind of point that's maybe important against Armodax too, is that in the process of doing damage to the other monster, in the process of your monsters taking licks on the other side of the board, if again the Armodax player has Armodax primarily in your power base and nearby your power base, then the destroying the buildings before Armodax goes hyper, honestly, just destroying as many buildings as you can. Collateral damage is better because collateral damage means that you didn't have to invest anything extra to get rid of them. But destroying any of those buildings early and leaving Armodax for late means that you're on equal playing field. Armor doesn't matter anymore if there are no buildings to crash into. If there's no collision damage to contend with, then you're both just kind of body slamming each other into fires for 2. And then suddenly that advantage from armored goes away. Suddenly the beatback is no better than a body slam or any other kind of attack.
Right. And I'll also just mention in that same game that I repaired a building to beat back into you, and you disintegrated it with vanguards. So just FYI, if you're wondering what vanguards are for, any destroyer players out there and not using them, give them a try.
Yeah, they could be interesting. I mean, like there's always a use for any kind of utility thing, but I think it's as with disintegration, especially with the if you're playing protector against protector, or with the advent of later in December where we've got Tharsis coming out, so every agenda is going to have access to repair. When you're up against Armodax, you have to really think twice about repairing things, extinguishing things, or stomping to extinguish fires, or I guess igniting things too. I had forgotten about I haven't had a chance to get the Scorchers to the table, but they'd be able to ignite fires. Still though, any fire damage that you get rid of, you have to really think about twice about it, because Armodax is going to be harder to deal with. You'll be on the same playing field, but only doing 1 damage at a time,
right?
It can get kind of rough.
If you're playing a monster who double attacks in hyper, it can actually be better to get rid of the fires, I would think.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, if you're just dealing with a single attack monster, or
Deimos or Sky Sentinel versus Armodax, it seems like.
Yeah, forcing him into a punching fight where, especially if it's on your side of the board, if it was Sky Sentinel versus Armodax and you just keep flying away and plinking him with a big pile of action dice and boost dice, and give that a shot, it's probably going to miss sometimes because action and boost dice are fickle. But I mean, even if it doesn't miss, then he's got to spend his entire movement heading over to you or waste action dice on steps. And then if you can drag him towards your side of the board, now all of a sudden the thing that would help him the most, Carnachon with flank, trying to get it over close to your side of the board becomes more difficult. Obviously, there's plenty of tricks to get units across the board, even when there are no buildings on the table. For protectors, you've got the Command Ape, you've got the Pterodactyx now with Toe. So there are ways to get that Carnodon moving to get the flank bonus going, but I guess that
it gets harder, and even in the end game when it's just one monster versus one monster, unit damage can be really critical for swinging the tempo. So Armodax having to come over to your side can be a real mess for him. Even though he has one more defense, it's frequently worth it to just use your unit turn in the last stages of the game to just pile up on the enemy monster and try to do 1 damage to him.
Sure, especially on some of the lighter foundation maps, the starter maps, Calamity Park and Destruction Junction. They have fewer buildings on them than the new Carnage Corners map does, and so as a result, you're more likely to knock out a lot of those buildings. You're more likely to end up in a situation where you could step a couple times and body slam, and then step again advance, body slam, and step a little bit and end up in a situation where you're safe enough that you're not going to take 3 damage again. That sort of thing is more likely to happen when you've got fewer building foundations running around. And so I think that, if you can get rid of those buildings and get rid of that armored advantage, and you're fighting on an even playing field, and you can attack more often than Armodax can, or you can leverage some other kind of benefit. There are even situations too where it's harder to do late game when there's less stuff to hide behind. But if you can screen yourself, Armodax is left with just doing a swat, and if you can get 2 damage in when all he's doing is swatting at you, then that can also be a good way to get an advantage out of the situation.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think that covers most of this third or fourth point that I wrote down here on this little paper that I'm looking at. And the only final thing I wanted to say was a bit about. Well, I have maps and matchups written down again. We did talk about the map issues a little already. There's a couple of matchup things I was thinking about. I think I was talking to you earlier about the fact that monsters who have super damage as their main hyper advantage do maybe suffer a little in trying to execute this strategy against Armodax.
Well, if they're the ones left alive,
right.
If they're the only one left, because otherwise their super damage doesn't get wasted if they're using it against Armodax's partner.
Right. The other monster.
But especially if you end up in a situation where, well, there aren't 2 resilience monsters, but generally monsters with super damage are going to have a harder time. Monsters with abilities to attack multiple times, they're going to have to invest those action dice in order to get those multiple attacks off. But so far, it seems like it's paid off, where you can get multiple attacks off. I mean, Demos is definitely one of them, just because Demos has flank already and does not need a Destructomite around in order to take advantage of that. Gets to attack twice, and then Armodax really can't screen against it either, because then either there's a building in the way and you can leverage the building, or you've got Fling on the brawls and you can still get the 2 damage in somehow. Similarly, Sky Sentinel has range 5. You're playing Protectors. You could potentially repair an additional range 6 out of a comms array.
Right.
So there are some situations where Armodax kind of flinches. I mean, when Yasheth hadn't come out yet, everybody was theory crafting, hey, maybe Yasheth is the great counter for Armodax because of Penetrator. And it definitely hurts Armodax to have somebody with Penetrator walk up and just get really easy hits off. But I think that generally, another thing that can be leveraged is, sorry, I didn't get to this earlier, but I had forgotten about it, was taking advantage of the fact that Armodax is pedestrian, has no flight or high mobility, is that in order to get around flight or high mobility, or the lack of that, typically you're going to grab as much movement as you can from other sources, either from Motivator or from the fuel depot off of the industrial complex, and as well getting additional movement from Mount Terra to be able to get Armodax where he needs to be for rampages, for any kind of shenanigans that you want to do with Armodax. And in the process of attacking the partner monster of Armodax, that it could also be helpful to try to remove those bonuses to movement speed, getting rid of the motivators, getting rid of the buildings that offer up the bonuses. Now, and again, with buildings, you don't necessarily have to destroy the buildings in order to accomplish that. You can also just walk up to them with your monsters, Once you're adjacent to them, then the Armodax player is no longer securing them, and then you could use that to prevent access to something important like Mount Terra that might get Armodax into a better situation on the following turn. But yeah, I think that matchup wise, Armodax kind of feels the pinch against monsters that get to attack multiple times. And I think also that as a follow on to that abuse of the lack of flight and high mobility is monsters like Pterodax actually will probably be really nasty for Armodax to play against, because if you can throw Armodax, especially early in the game, if you could throw Armodax away from the action and force Armodax to trundle around and get back by wasting a lot of steps, then Pterodax is going to be able to throw +2 speed or +2 range. You could potentially throw for 12 if you needed to invest that many power dice. Usually it's not a good idea to invest that many power dice, but regardless, being able to throw for an easy, maybe 7 or 8, get Armodax as far away as possible, force that player to spend dice to catch back up with you, and then you use those action dice to instead of catching back up with Armodax, then just use those to hit Armodax instead.
Right.
So those are a couple of things that are kind of rough for Armodax, but definitely Armodax is great when that monster works against monsters that rely on super damage, that rely on power attacks for throws and things like that. Then it really, I understand where the frustration and the difficulty comes from, because it kind of feels like it changes the game a little bit, right? Where you are no longer able to successfully rely on power attacks to get the monster all the way from 12 to 0.
Right.
You can. It's a lot harder, because instead of it being 4 attacks, now all of a sudden it's 6, and that's either one more turn if you have all of your monsters alive still, or 2 more turns if you don't. That gives Armodax player a lot more leeway to find some way in, find some creative solution, and really mess you up. So it can be difficult to deal with from that perspective. But I think that's just, as you mentioned, since beatback is such a great support skill, getting the ability for it to support anybody off the table and just turning it into an offensive boost is probably one of the strongest things to do against Armodax.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that covers just about everything I wanted to talk about. Is there any points that I would want to bring up? One thing I just wanted to reemphasize is sort of about splitting damage, and when you were playing against Armodax against me, like the strategy you described often involves sort of purposefully splitting damage, in that you're trying to get your monsters focused on the non-Armodax monster, but you are using your units to ping points off Armodax here and there. And that's the strategy, and that's fine. You don't have to feel like, because you started on Armodax, that now you have to commit your life and soul to just focusing him down.
Right. Yeah, that's an important point that I don't necessarily know if everybody's aware of, is that if you start hitting one monster, and this is partially why King Kondo is really pretty solid. If you start hitting one monster, it usually behooves you to continue hitting that monster until they're dead, because if they survive while they're in hyper form and they survive for multiple turns, then they're going to get all of their cool abilities for many turns. If you can force them to have their cool abilities for just 1 turn or even less, then that's what you're kind of trying to go for. But if you split your damage and you say, Armodax is in a good position right now, I could throw him for 4. I'm not going to get that chance again for the rest of the game potentially, because I'm going to throw him into 2 buildings that are on fire. Well, if you take that bait and you go for Armodax after you've already hit maybe Sky Sentinel, then Sky Sentinel's taken 3 damage. You put 4 damage on Armodax. You throw Sky Sentinel again. I mean, like, there are opportunities for either of the 2 monsters to get into hyper, or one of them to be in hyper while the other one is able to contribute as well. Even just the extra boost dice from the extra monster being in hyper can spell your doom, because then that means there's less power dice going into an attack, which means that Armodax gets more of those power dice. And so, I think that start on 1, finish on 1. If the units get some damage in, that's a bonus, not necessarily like a life or death thing that has to happen.
Right. But I still think that, but in general, the plan is not, if you start on Armodax, you might want to think twice about making him the one you finish on, for all the reasons we've described so far.
Right,
because once you get him into hyper, he's pouring power dice into his power pool, and you can't really hyper him and get him off the board that turn, except in the most extreme situations. I guess if you line him up just right on that Carnage corner spot,
or a 3 monster game.
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah.
But yeah, I think that that's a fair consideration, is that, like I had kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, that it's going to take some creativity, it's going to take some problem solving, and you won't necessarily always have the same solution. If you just let your units take care of Armodax, then Armodax could run ref shot over your entire power base, and then you have no power dice with which to actually attack the enemy monster. And so there might need to be some creative solutions there, either with having your units move forward past Armodax, having your units attack enemy units for power, attack even buildings for power. Destroyers happen to be advantageous in this situation because they have access to Siphon, either with Hyper Yasheth or with the Hellion. That would give you, at least while you're trying to accomplish your goal of hitting Armodax, at least a little bit of power income trickling in. But generally, it's a little bit of, it can be difficult. You don't entirely want to ignore Armodax, but if you spend, choosing when to hyper Armodax is difficult, because if you hold off when you could do damage, you may regret it. If you push forward and do damage just because damage can be done, putting Armodax in hyper could, generate enough power dice on the hyper form that all of a sudden you regret that too. And so it can be kind of delicate sometimes, especially with the fact that Armodax is pedestrian. Once you get Armodax close to hypering up, then it is within the...
Yeah, he could just walk into a fire and deliberately hyper himself.
Right, so the Armodax player can have control over whether or not to hyper, even if you decide, I don't want to do it.
Right.
It can still happen despite your best wishes.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that pretty much covers what we can cover based on our own experience.
Yeah, I hope some of that was helpful. I just, I think that maybe one of the things to take away the most is just that the armored ability is very strong as long as buildings are in play. If the buildings can be gone, then you've kind of leveled the playing field somewhat.
Right.
Multiple attacks against Armodax can be very strong, and that really in the end, that creative problem solving on the board is kind of the soup du jour when Armodax is there, because you can't expect to just play the same kind of game against Armodax that you'd be able to play against Gorgadra or some other monster.
Right. Okay, well, that's great. Well, thank you for having this conversation, and I'm going to try to get it up on YouTube as soon as possible and just let the community know about it and see what kind of response it gets.
Yeah, hopefully this is helpful for someone.